You think the biggest threat to the black community are the loud extremists who openly show their hate. No. The real danger is the so-called moderates who smile in your face but secretly agree with that hate. And Tariq Nasheed exposed one of them live. Let me show you how. Over the past week, Tariq Nasheed has been hosting a series of Twitter spaces centered on the recent death of Charlie Kirk. The subject matter alone has sparked heated reactions, drawing in listeners who either feel strongly in support or deeply opposed. The discussions have been so charged that Kirk's loyal followers frequently join the chat, eager to defend his legacy. More often than not, these guests are older or younger white men who carry a visible disdain for black people. But today's session stood out because the person who requested the mic wasn't one of the usual voices. It was a white woman. Unlike the typical confrontational energy, she entered the conversation calmly, almost offering an olive branch. She made it clear she wasn't asking anyone to feel sympathy for Kirk. What she admired, she explained, was his willingness to engage in civil debate, even with those who completely disagreed with him. To her, that spirit of dialogue was something America desperately needed, especially at a time when political violence seems not only to be rising but also celebrated. Whatever flaws Kirk may have had, she argued, his openness to conversation deserved recognition. Her approach was noticeably different. She wasn't looking to provoke or stir conflict, and that shifted the dynamic entirely. Tariq Nasheed, known for his sharp wit when handling hostile callers, proved equally adaptable when met with moderation and respect. Instead of firing back with humor, he leaned in, listening carefully, and assessing what kind of person he was really engaging with. For a moment, it wasn't clear to him until he posed one pointed question that revealed much more. At one point in the conversation, Tariq Nasheed cut straight to the core with a question that carried real weight. "Let me ask you this, George Floyd. Do you think he died of asphyxiation or fentanyl?" It wasn't a casual question. The way someone answers it, whether they realize it or not, reveals far more about their true perspective than they may intend. People often try to dodge such questions, worried about how their response might come across, especially if it risks sounding racist. And that's exactly why Tariq asked. It forced her to take a stance on ground that many prefer to avoid. Her answer, though wavered, she admitted she hadn't really looked into the case in detail, but felt that the way Floyd was treated by officers was way over the top and deeply disturbing, regardless of what the medical cause of death turned out to be. When Tariq pressed further, asking again if she believed it was fentanyl or asphyxiation, she said she assumed it was asphyxiation but insisted she hadn't done enough research to be sure. Tariq didn't let that slide. He reminded her of the video that had been seen across the world, the footage of an officer pressing his knee into Floyd's neck as Floyd repeated, "I can't breathe." How could anyone watch that and not conclude what happened? If the roles had been reversed, if a black person had knelt on a white person's neck, would she be this hesitant to call it murder? Her answers stayed not. She acknowledged that what she saw looked brutal and excessive, but kept circling back to uncertainty about the official cause of death. Too many, this kind of middle ground response seems safe, even reasonable. "I don't know exactly, but it looked wrong." But to Tariq, it exposed something deeper: reluctance to name the truth plainly. Eventually, she exited the discussion, and Tariq reflected on what had just happened. This, he argued, is the danger of so-called moderates. They present themselves as neutral, as the reasonable middle, but beneath that surface often lies quiet agreement with the very rhetoric they claim to distance themselves from. They praise figures like Charlie Kirk, not because they reject his message, but because he says out loud what they feel they cannot. That's why Tariq drew a distinction. The most openly extreme voices, the Nick Fuentes, the hardline MAGA figures, the unapologetic racists, aren't the greatest threat to black communities. They are upfront about their hostility, and that honesty at least makes them easier to identify and understand. The real danger, he argued, comes from the moderates, the ones who smile, claim fairness, and say we're all just Americans, while quietly endorsing the same anti-black sentiments in softer tones. Tariq Nasheed made a sharp distinction in his breakdown. The loud, openly hostile voices aren't the most dangerous to black people. It's the so-called moderates who pose the greater threat. They speak in contradictions, claiming what happened to George Floyd was wrong, yet refusing to say how he died, distancing themselves from racism, yet admiring figures like Charlie Kirk for keeping it real. They talk about unity and political peace, but behind the language of togetherness, their loyalties remain firmly planted. Tariq's point was simple: you can't straddle all those positions at once. One phrase the caller used stuck out. She lamented political violence. Tariq cut through that quickly. Political violence, he argued, isn't something black people are responsible for. If we're talking about petty street crime, that exists, yes, but organized political violence, black communities have no reason to engage in it. Neither party offers us genuine respect or power, so there's no incentive to fight for either. For a white woman to enter a black Twitter space and complain about political violence was, in his view, absurd. That problem isn't ours, belongs to her community. Tariq then pointed to a contradiction he's seen firsthand at marches and rallies across the country. At Black Lives Matter protests, crowds are filled with white participants carrying signs, shouting "No justice, no peace." Yet in courtroom after courtroom, when justice for black victims is on the line, juries rarely deliver accountability. I looked around, Tariq said, and thought, wait a minute, if all these white folks are out here with lunchboxes and thermoses ready to protest, why couldn't 12 of them make it onto a jury and deliver justice? The answer, he argued, is that they are in the courtroom but their decisions don't reflect their protest signs. That's the deeper problem. He suggested, too many black people mistake visible solidarity for genuine commitment. They see crowds of white protesters and believe, as Stephen Jackson once said after George Floyd's death, the whole world is with us. But many of those same people go home, return to their private circles, and continue to uphold the very system they claim to oppose. Publicly, they play the role of allies. Privately, they remain invested in protecting their own. This is why Tariq and thinkers before him like John Henrik Clarke, Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X have long stressed the importance of self. For generations, they warned black communities that dependence on white liberals, their validation, their money, or their political structures was a trap. Each time black progress seemed to hinge on the goodwill of liberal allies, disappointment followed. Liberalism often positioned itself as the friend of racial justice, but history shows that when the demands of black people conflicted with the comfort or interests of white liberals, compromise and even betrayal was the inevitable outcome. Think back to the civil rights era. White liberals were present at marches, rallies, and photo opportunities. They spoke the language of inclusion and fairness. Yet when it came time to move from symbolic gestures to substantive changes, jobs, housing, wealth redistribution, community control, their enthusiasm waned. They loved the idea of racial justice in the abstract but shrank from the hard realities of restructuring power. That same pattern repeats today. Black communities are encouraged to vote as a bloc, to deliver massive political returns to liberal candidates. But when those candidates win, the resources and protections promised rarely materialize at the level that would truly shift conditions in black neighborhoods. Tariq single quotes as critique builds on this legacy of disappointment. True empowerment, he argues, cannot come from a system that was never designed to center or prioritize black life. It requires independence, building institutions controlled by black people, circulating wealth within black neighborhoods, and developing cultural and political infrastructures that do not rise and fall depending on who sits in office. Dependence means vulnerability, because when your progress depends on someone else's validation, you're always at their mercy. And this brings us back to the so-called moderates. On the surface, moderates seem safe. They don't march with tiki torches, they don't wear red MAGA hats, and they don't spray paint swastikas. They present themselves as reasonable, balanced, good people who are uncomfortable with extremes. But Tariq insists that this facade is precisely what makes them so dangerous. Unlike the extremists, who declare their hatred openly, moderates cloak their beliefs in civility. They speak softly, couch their words in ambiguity, and avoid overt confrontation. Yet their silence and inaction often align them with the very systems and ideologies that oppress black communities. Consider how moderates react when confronted with direct questions. Tariq's exchange with the white woman caller is a perfect example. Asked whether George Floyd died from asphyxiation or fentanyl, she chose the middle ground. She said she didn't know. She insisted she hadn't researched it enough. She admitted the footage looked brutal, but hedged every statement with uncertainty. On the surface, her response may sound thoughtful, cautious, unwilling to jump to conclusions, but Tariq recognized it as a calculated dodge. By refusing to name the obvious, by avoiding the truth captured on camera for the entire world to see, she protected herself from having to take a firm moral position. This is the hallmark of moderates. They want to appear fair, measured, objective. They resist taking sides. Yet when the issue at hand is as stark as a man suffocating under the weight of a police officer's knee, refusing to take a side is itself a choice. Neutrality, in such a case, does not equal fairness, it equals complicity. And Tariq knows that if the roles had been reversed, if a black man had knelt on a white man's neck until he died, these same moderates would not hesitate to call it murder. They would not retreat into uncertainty. Their objectivity would vanish, replaced by outrage and demands for accountability. This double standard is precisely what makes moderates more insidious than extremists. Extremists show you who they are. They spit their venom openly, and because of that, they can be named, confronted, and resisted. But moderates hide behind civility, leaving black people unsure whether they are allies, enemies, or something in between. They show up at protests holding Black Lives Matter signs. But when the trial comes, they sit silently in jury boxes, siding with officers who brutalize black bodies. They chant no justice, no peace, but when policy decisions are on the line, they vote to maintain the very structures that deny justice and ensure continued inequality. Tariq's observations at rallies capture this contradiction. He noticed the abundance of white faces in the crowd, marching, shouting, raising fists in solidarity. On the surface, it looked like a turning point, evidence that white America had finally woken up. But he asked the critical question: if so many white people are willing to stand here in the streets, why is it impossible to find 12 of them to deliver justice in a courtroom? The answer, he suggested, is not that these people don't exist, it's that even when they do sit in those positions of power, their decisions reveal where their true loyalties lie. Protest is cheap, accountability is costly, and moderates rarely choose cost over comfort. This duplicity is part of why Tariq aligns himself with the teachings of black nationalist thinkers who advocated independence. John Henrik Clark, Elijah Muhammad, and Malcolm X each understood that liberation could not come from the benevolence of others. Clark famously said that power is something you take, not something you're given. Elijah Muhammad built institutions like the Nation of Islam's businesses and schools, emphasizing economic independence. Malcolm X pushed relentlessly for self-determination, warning against the seduction of white validation. Tariq echoes this lineage. If black people remain dependent on white liberals, people who see them as useful during election cycles but expendable afterward, will continue to be vulnerable to betrayal. Moderates also benefit from a peculiar kind of invisibility. Because they don't spew overtly racist rhetoric, they're rarely called out. Because they occasionally show up in support of protests, they earn credibility as allies. But beneath the surface, they reinforce the very systems they claim to oppose. Tariq calls this beckying up the routine of feigning ignorance, acting confused or downplaying responsibility when pressed about racial violence. "I didn't really see the video. My memory's fuzzy. I can't judge." These phrases allow moderates to sidestep accountability while still appearing decent and thoughtful. It's a performance of ignorance, and it protects the very systems that oppress. The danger here is subtle but profound. When black communities place their trust in moderates, they mistake visibility for solidarity. They believe that white faces in protest crowds signal a shift in societal values. They assume that polite words and peaceful gestures mean shared commitment. But as Tariq points out, those same people often retreat into their neighborhoods, workplaces, and courtrooms where their actions or inactions speak louder than their slogans. Their loyalty remains not with justice, but with preserving their own safety and privilege. That's why Tariq insists independence is the only path forward. Relying on moderates leaves black communities in a perpetual state of disappointment, always waiting for promises to be fulfilled, always shocked when solidarity evaporates under pressure. Independence, by contrast, builds resilience. It means investing in black-owned businesses, supporting black schools, and creating cultural infrastructures that cannot be easily dismantled by outside forces. It means refusing to let white liberals define the terms of progress, and instead, setting an agenda rooted in black needs and visions. And perhaps most importantly, it means recognizing moderates for what they are. They may not wear the face of the enemy, but their actions and inactions often serve the same ends. Their polite ambiguity, their unwillingness to name injustice plainly, and their hidden admiration for figures like Charlie Kirk make them complicit in maintaining the very systems they claim to stand against. For Tariq, this is why he actually respects extremists more than moderates. With extremists, you know exactly what you're dealing with. With moderates, you're dealing with a mask. At the end of the day, the real danger isn't the loudest voices but the quietest ones. The voices that whisper neutrality, that retreat into confusion, that plead ignorance when truth is unavoidable. Those are the voices that black communities must learn to hear clearly, for beneath their civility lies a deeper betrayal. Tariq's challenge is not simply to call out the extremists who burn crosses. but to expose the moderates who hold signs with one hand while holding the system intact with the other. That, he argues, is where the real struggle lies.
I would go to these protests and these rallies all around the country, and I see all these white people, and I would think, I said, wait a minute. We got a lot of white people out here. How come we couldn't get 12 of them in the jury? In all of these cases around the country where these suspected white supremacists harm black people, there's never justice in the courtroom. But when you go to the streets, it's white people out there with lunch boxes and thermoses. They're out there before us yelling, no justice, no peace. They're out there with picket signs, Black Lives Matter. I put two and two together. I said, wait a minute. I know at least 12 of these people could have been in the courtroom. What happened?
But Tariq reminded his audience, if the roles were reversed, there would be no hesitation. If a black man knelt on a white man's neck until he died, those same moderates wouldn't stutter for a second before calling it murder and demanding life in prison. The outrage would be immediate, unified, and uncompromising. There would be no hedging, no claims of not enough research, no careful attempts to straddle the middle. The headlines would scream murder, the courts would move with urgency, and society at large would accept that verdict without question. That's the double standard. When violence is directed toward black bodies, suddenly everything becomes complicated. Suddenly, context is demanded. Excuses multiply: drug use, criminal records, bad choices, poor decisions. Death becomes negotiable. Blame becomes transferable, and responsibility is blurred until accountability disappears. But when the victim is white, the lines are sharp, the consequence is clear, and the moral judgment absolute. Tariq's point cut through the performance of neutrality. Moderation, dressed up as fairness, is far more dangerous than outright hostility because it disguises bias under the cloak of reason. The moderates' greatest weapon is ambiguity. They avoid sounding hateful while quietly maintaining the same imbalance of power. Their both sides posture allows them to appear rational while denying justice. By refusing to name murder when it happens in plain sight, they help normalize it. Their civility becomes complicity. And because they smile, use calm tones, and occasionally show up at protests, they are harder to confront than the extremists who wear their hatred openly. This is what Tariq wanted his audience to understand. The so-called moderates lull people into believing they are allies, when in reality, their refusal to confront injustice head-on strengthens the very structures they claim to resist. In the end, it is not the loud bigot but the silent neutral who poses the greater threat.